Lynn, this next question comes from, well, I have to admit that I've kind of reconstructed this question because we've gotten 5 or 6 questions in from different professors at different universities who are working both on certain policy questions through think tanks, but have also, as a result of that, embarked on various studies of some of your work and of certain aspects of U.S. history as it relates to that. And what I've done is I've mushed it all together into one question. So, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that Lynn won't have any problem dealing with it, but for those who submitted the questions, if you kind of see elements of your question, but then it goes somewhere else and you say, hey, that's not what I said, please understand that I took these liberties for the sake of time. Even as it is, it's a long question. Mr. LaRouche, I and various colleagues around the country, joined by various students and graduate students, have been following your analysis and proposals on the economy with increasing interest over the past couple of years, especially as your forecasts have proven to be more and more accurate. Of course, now everything depends on what we need to do to fix the economic and financial mess that we are in. And while we're strongly drawn to your proposals, we are also hoping for clarification on some very crucial points that you've been making, which people ask us repeatedly and which we cannot answer. It concerns the distinction you draw between what you call the monetary systems that European countries have and the credit system that the U.S. has. Our questions concern better defining what the distinction is, why you think the U.S. has a different system than Europe, and where in the U.S. Constitution the idea of a credit system is provided for. Specifically on the first, our best inference is that by monetary system, you mean a system where private banks and or privately held central banks like the Bank of England can create money, lend money, and that they don't have as deposits. And by a credit system, you mean where the government itself is actually tasked with creating money, can create credits by lending money it hasn't raised, et cetera, et cetera. So if this is the distinction you're making, whether it's the government that's in charge or the private banks, then our second question is, this is where it gets confusing. It appears that the U.S., whatever the intention was, now has as much of a monetary system as Europe, since only the Federal Reserve, a private bank, seems to have the power to create money as loans, that is, credit not backed by anything, and that the Congress does not have this power. So on that basis, I don't understand how we have a credit system. It seems right now to be operating in the same way that the European system is. If the issue is that we are not operating according to the basic ideas of our founding fathers, then please clarify that. But we believe that if we can just resolve this question, we can go forward with your proposals and make much more rapid progress than we've made to date.
Well, the question does fairly describe the parameters of the issue. The difference is, since, as I put it this way, in the history of empire, we take a certain segment of imperialism's history and locate it as the point that the Persian Empire had been defeated in its attempt to take over the Mediterranean region. And at this point, what happened is the Athens and Corinth, otherwise known as the Spartan faction, entered into what became known the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War was actually run by the cult of Delphi, which was the center of the monetary system of that period. You will find, if you look at the aerial photographs or similar photographs of the Delphi cult site today, you'll find that next to the temple there's a ring of little so-called treasuries, which represent the financial interests of various cities of Greece in particular. And so this was the monetary power. Now then you had the two maritime powers, one centered in Greece, one centered on Corinth, one centered on Athens. And these two got into a war over which, now that the Persian Empire had lost its influence over the Mediterranean, the question was which of these two Greek empires, or so-called empires, would now have maritime supremacy throughout the Mediterranean, and also deal with the thing in Syracuse, for example, the same way. That's why this extension of the war to Syracuse. From this point on, all European systems of government and finance from that time until the present in Europe have been monetary systems in which private interests, monetarist interests, not necessarily banking, but the monetarist interests, because the banking, you cannot say that banks and monetary systems are the same thing. They're not necessarily the same things. It's the monetary system you're looking at, not the banks. But the banks have been generally tools or subordinates of that. For example, like the great crisis of Italy that led into the New Dark Age. You had banks in northern Italy, which were the banks that went under. But the monetary power was in Venice, not in the banks of northern Italy. In the case of the House of Bardi. The House of Bardi was a bank of a particular city, a very small city, Lucca. And this bank was the bank which was key in the crash of the entire financial system, monetary system of Europe in that time. But the power of this was in Venice, which was the monetary power. Now, the monetary power typified by Venice then is still the monetary conception of monetary power in Europe today. So Europe never had a successfully consolidated system of self-government which was not controlled by monetary power. The United States was created beginning with a policy of the Massachusetts Bay Colony prior to 1688, in which the Massachusetts Bay Colony had developed a scrip system, that is a credit system within the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was autonomous under the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was shut down by the British in 1688-89. This idea persisted into the 18th century, in this idea where the idea of a paper currency by Benjamin Franklin was an expression of this same thing, who followed the Massachusetts Bay precedent in this matter. Then you had the Revolutionary War, where the private banks, that's the state-chartered banks of the various colonies who had participated, the 13 colonies that participated in the revolution, now came to the end. We'd won the war, but the banks were bankrupt as a result of the war debt. At this point, Hamilton developed a concept which led to the formation of the U.S. federal Constitution. And that was that to create a national bank, which would be the facility to put the state banks through reorganization in order to save the U.S. system at that time. Obviously, to have that kind of authority, you had to pass over from a federation of separate state former colonies into a federal government. And therefore, it was around this conception of Hamilton that the idea of the Constitution was created. The Declaration of Independence had the same principle in it from Leibniz. But now we had a new problem, to take the same principle that was in the Declaration of Independence and now express it in a form which would deal with this question of a national credit system. So the United States was from inception based on a Hamiltonian notion of a credit system in which no foreign banks or no private banks would have sovereignty over national banking. But national banking would be, and the control of the currency would be entirely by the people through the constitutional structure, a national constitutional structure, and with a national banking concept to deal with this. So my particular proposal, of course, is eliminate the Federal Reserve System, which is a piece of poison, a British piece of poison, actually, and just absorb the Federal Reserve, which is already bankrupt, in fact, under examination. Absorb it and say, put it into reorganization under the authority of a newly created national bank. In other words, it would not be the Treasury Department, but the Treasury Department would be the relevant agency supervising the national bank as to various means. But then the national bank would itself take charge of the commercial types of debt and protect the system. Now that was shut down by a man who was actually quite a traitor. It's called Andrew Jackson, later as president. And Andrew Jackson was the guy who shut down the bank for the sake of the New York banking interests, which are British interests, Van Buren. And Van Buren launched the other banking system, which collapsed in the great crisis of 1837. So he quickly went from one measure to a complete bankruptcy again. So we've had this, and then Lincoln faced with the same problem. We had to defend the United States against the British Empire, which was right behind the Confederacy. So what Lincoln did was went to greenbacks. Now, greenbacks are a form of credit uttered by the U.S. government, by the Treasury Department, under law, under a credit system. And when the British wanted to defeat the United States after Lincoln was dead, after all, it was their war, the British ready to set up the war, the first attack was on greenbackism, to destroy the power of the United States to create its own credit. This was then consolidated through the aid of Teddy Roosevelt, who was a British agent. His father was, after all, was a Confederate spy. His uncle was a Confederate spy. And then became, later, with Teddy Roosevelt's support, under Woodrow Wilson became the Federal Reserve System. And then became also the federal tax system. The federal income tax system was a creation as a byproduct of the Federal Reserve System. So there has been an evolution, a devolution in U.S. economic policy. We have to go back to our founding principle. The whole system is now bankrupt. It should be obvious to everyone that the present United States system is bankrupt. Now what we have to do is take the relevant formal legislation, Glass-Steagall, and go through every bank with a sieve. And every aspect of a bank system which has Glass-Steagall conforming standard product in it, that has to be put under bankruptcy protection and secured. Just plain secured. Those things which do not correspond to that, such as what used to be the Wall Street financing, which Larry Summers brought in to contaminate overthrow Glass-Steagall, that has to be just wiped off. In other words, these guys are going to take the heat and eat the meat. And we're going to put the system back where it was before Larry Summers destroyed Glass-Steagall. Now, under that system, we will park and take the U.S. assets, which are now classed as monetary assets on the one side. We're going to move these as we put them through the Glass-Steagall standard sieve and move them across to another department, which is the U.S. credit system. We will then be required, if we're wise, to create a national bank of a Hamiltonian state type as Hamilton himself had intended to handle this problem. Under that basis, we now have reorganized things. We will now take measures under bankruptcy reorganization to protect those things which are essential and to settle claims which are not necessarily essential. And in that way, we will now put ourselves in a position to utter credit from the federal government by law, which will be mandated for specific projects, typified by what happened with the Tennessee Valley Authority, that kind of operation. We're going to have to go at the infrastructure end. We're going to have to scrape from those sands everything that looked like an auto industry's machine tool capability. We're going to have to take the area in which these machine tool based plants existed. We're going to have to consider the fact that the populations which lived in that area need a job. And they have the kind of skills which are required for the kinds of infrastructure projects we for river systems, mass transportation systems, and so forth. Then we will use these projects to build up the productive power and skills of our population. We will be on the road to recovery. We won't be at recovery, we'll be on the road to recovery. Once we're on the road to recovery, then we can say to ourselves that our credit is good. And we're going to have to write the contracts, in effect. And the government will be involved with the head of national banking in writing the contracts which will provide for those projects which are judged to be sound in the interest of the nation to get them moving. We're going to move this country of ours, we'll move it back to the large-scale infrastructure projects on which industrial and agricultural production depends. Move it back in that direction and spin off a recovery of what the United States used to be by that method. It will take a generation or two to do it. But we'll be on the road up all the way through, not on the road down. We'll go the end of going down to going up. And the important thing here is, in a sense, psychological. You have an American people, citizenry, which are demoralized in every sense of the word. Their society has failed them. They have been abandoned. They're on a sinking ship. They see no hope of the future. They have silly dreams that they can get luck at a gambling deal or something like that. They don't have any sense of the future. They don't have a sense, I built this. They don't have a sense of the grandfather that's going out to his grandson and saying, look, I built this. And that's the way you move the American people in the best way, when you get that idea across. But we have to create the ingredients of credibility by taking the measures which create the basis for people to believe in this stuff, and make sure we have the politicians and the institutions which are committed to delivering on that promise. We just restore the credit system. We can do it. If we look at our history, we can do it. Other countries which have ever since the Peloponnesian War, Europe has never had, except for brief intervals, a cultural concept of this kind of principle, of a credit system. All this period, from the Peloponnesian War, the world has been dominated by maritime-based monetary systems, which have ruled over nations and have been called empires and are empires. Empires are not really empires of one nation conquering another. Empires are the rule of all nations by this kind of monetary system. That's what we have to do.